Hello and welcome to the Facing Up podcast with me, Luke Grenfell-Shaw. Today, I have Leon McCarron with me here in our virtual studio. Leon has had a life already full of experiences. He has done all sorts of adventures, from cycling from New York to Hong Kong, walking across the empty quarter, so a large chunk of desert in Oman and United Arab Emirates. And then more recently has been involved in setting up trails such as the Masa Ibrahim in Palestine, setting up trails in China, in northern Iraq. And I'm really excited today, Leon, to sort of talk about your journey, where the challenges have been, and how they've changed in nature, I suppose, as well, from your earlier times to the present day. So thanks so much for joining me on Facing Up.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. And it's a fascinating topic to get a little bit of a chance to dig into.
Yeah, I'm really excited. I always look forward to these conversations. Can you just take us back? Where did you grow up? What were the kind of circumstances? You're obviously a high-flying adventurer now, but where did you begin this journey?
Well, I am from Northern Ireland originally. My mum's Irish and my dad's Scottish. And so we moved a few times between Northern Ireland and Scotland, Aberdeen and the sort of northeast part of Scotland, until I was about 7 or 8. And then I spent the rest of my formative childhood years on the north coast of Ireland, which is a remarkably beautiful place. It's a part of the world which is really very small, relatively, but as a child, it feels vast because I was fortunate to be able to get out into the countryside and run around, and I was one of those kids who spent more time outside than ever inside. And I think a lot of that part of growing up has informed some of the decisions I've made later in life. Certainly the interest and appreciation I have for the outdoors, the gratitude I have then and now for ever being able to get into the outdoors. And I say this as I'm sat in West London at the moment, very far from the wilderness. And I stayed in Ireland until I was 17, and I went to university in the southeast of England, and really stayed there for 3 years studying. And so I got to the age of my early 20s without really having ever had any experience of travel or getting out. My horizons were not very far off. I was pretty sheltered up to that point.
Did your parents kind of push you into the outdoors, or was this all kind of very much off your own bat, and just sort of left free to roam?
I grew up rurally, so I mean, there was possibly a certain amount of pushing, but it was also just practical. We lived on a farm, so it was natural to spend a lot of time outside. Some of it was functional, helping with animals and helping out in the fields, but a lot of it was just simply that there was a lot more space outdoors than there was indoors, and why on earth would you spend any time inside? So, I mean, my mum in particular was very keen that I spend time learning about the outdoors, but there really wasn't any other option anyway.
And was that something? Was that quite a sociable activity, or was that kind of quite a lot of solo adventuring?
Yeah, I mean, certainly wasn't very sociable. There aren't very many people in Northern Ireland to begin with, and there are even fewer around where I lived. I went to a primary school that had 52 pupils in total. So there was 4 pupils in my year group, but the whole primary school was only 2 rooms, so lots of different year groups shared. So all that to give an indication that, and I'm an only child, so I wasn't necessarily a childhood of solitude. There was definitely other people around, but a lot of the times when I would be in summer holidays and so on, I would spend a lot of time on my own, just out in the woodland.
Okay. And I'm also just interested, talking about Northern Ireland. we're just about still in the time of the Troubles. I'm realizing that my like British history is somewhat lacking at this point. Did that have any kind of impact? Was that at all relevant, or you?
Not really. I mean, it's anyone who grows up in Northern Ireland grows up with an understanding one way or another, implicitly at least, about what it is, and it's an unusual place to grow up. The divisions are certainly very apparent. Most towns and villages are quite adamantly either Catholic or Protestant areas, and so there's a lot of there was a lot of marking of territory going on. But I mean, in terms of violence or any more active representations of the Troubles, that was both slightly before my time and also when it wasn't. It was in the bigger places like Belfast and like Derry, and where we were so far from anyone. No, there wasn't much to notice.
And you didn't have kind of trouble crossing from one bit of woodland into another, or like certain fences. I think I've got in trouble before from sort of swinging over a barbed wire fence and realizing you're in the wrong place.
I mean, I think there's occasionally neighbouring farmers who wouldn't have been too happy about us going to places we weren't meant to be, but there's a lot of woodland around that we could use, and pretty early on, if you grew up in the countryside, the rules of engagement are drilled into you as to which part of a metal gate to climb over. For example, you're told very, very quickly which part you can climb over and which part you're not allowed to, and
yes,
and that minimizes the chances of an angry farmer.
Yes, I remember one of my ineptitudes being outdoors was when I was swinging my leg over a barbed wire fence, and it was a freezing cold day. Like it was chucking it down with rain, so I was quite stiff and not that supple. And I ended up just lacerating the inside of my knee going over a barbed wire fence, which was...
my goodness, that sounds awful.
Yeah, it wasn't a particularly smart thing to do. It was fine. It wasn't like a huge cut, but it was a bit of a learning experience.
Yeah, well, it all is. I mean, I learned, I think a lot of that stuff is very useful as a kid. I mean, it teaches you about your own sort of abilities or inabilities as well, as much as it teaches you about the specifics of where it is that you're trying to go. And I'm very grateful for a lot of that from those days, which I probably don't acknowledge in my own head as much as I should. So
you had quite an adventurous, outdoorsy childhood. You went to uni down in the southeast of England. Was that a time which fueled your adventure? Like, what happened when you graduated? And
well, I mean, going to university was by far the biggest shock culturally that I'd ever had. I mean, I came from a pretty sheltered upbringing in Northern Ireland to suddenly just being surrounded by lots and lots and lots of people, and people who were much wiser about the world than I. And I hadn't lived on my own. I rarely spent much time with people outside of where I was from. I had to learn how to slow down and modulate my accent so anyone could understand me. I didn't think I had a particularly strong accent, but it was strong enough. So, I mean, all of those things were a huge shock. And I think part of that experience of university was in leaving behind for a little while the childhood I had. I mean, suddenly I really felt like this guy just being dragged in from a hedgerow somewhere and thrown into a cool multicultural suburban lifestyle in Canterbury. And so I left it behind and just tried to, I lived a university life for 3 years, and I went out a little bit, but running and, out along the Kent coast, but I didn't do a huge amount. And it was only towards the end of my time there that I started to appreciate the upbringing I'd had and the outdoors access that I'd had, and then also to wonder what I might do when I was finished. And I started to get the bug to travel, as so many people do, and that was the first part of the process of how I decided to end up going on a long cycling trip.
So what were your plans or aspirations in your final year in Kent?
I wanted to do something creative. I wanted to make films or write, but I wasn't sure beyond that. And I was definitely aware that it was a challenging time. I was graduating in 2008, and it was
Okay.
already becoming pretty clear that that wasn't the best time to be knocking on doors looking for jobs.
Right.
Um, and I, yeah, it started, as I imagine it maybe it did for you, and it has done for a lot of people. It started just as a very small idea in the back of my head to try something quite adventurous, to use some time and to try something and do something a bit different. And the more it stayed there, the more it grew and morphed and changed. And actually, one of the big turning points for me was seeing a TV show at the time called Long Way Round, which was
Mm.
about a motorbike journey of the actor Ewan McGregor and Charlie Boorman and these two friends and their cameraman Claudio Von Planta motorbike around the world. And I didn't know how to ride a motorbike, and I couldn't afford to buy one, but I loved the freedom and the sense of going off under one's own steam.
Yeah.
And that really gave me the sense that maybe if I was going to travel, I should try and do it in a way that was a little bit more unusual.
Do it properly, not cheap with some engine on the back.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, I have to say I was probably forced into that, but I came to, yeah, I hadn't really been a cyclist before that, but the bicycle I came to realize was a great tool for travel and a great way to bring me to new places. And I suppose that was, at the time, I'd really enjoyed getting quite fit and running quite a lot and sort of testing the limits of my body a little bit more than I'd ever done before that. And so this was a way to add a physical challenge to what was going to be a very mental one as well.
There's a couple of things that I think are super interesting. One, which is that, that idea in the back of your head, that little voice that says, oh, have you thought about doing this? And I think that now I recognize that as one of those voices that you should fan the flames of, because it tends to lead you in a really interesting direction. It's that sort of that slightly more creative, daring side that it's very easy to say shut up to. That's ridiculous. All these things might happen if you do that, but actually I found some of the decisions, at least I consider to be good ones, have come from that little voice, such as playing the bagpipes, which I think everyone else thinks was a terrible decision. But it graces the start of these episodes anyway, which is, again, probably another reason why everyone thinks I should have not listened to that voice.
I look forward to hearing that.
Yeah. But I completely get as well what you're saying about the bike and the physical challenge, because that, for me, one of the first times I listened to that voice was when I had this idea on New Year's Eve in 2012. I was like, oh, I could cycle from Land's End to John O'Groats. I was on my gap year, didn't have anything to do. And I was like, oh, I actually could. And then the next day I got a train down to Penzance and I cycled from Land's End to John O'Groats in winter, and it ended up being fantastic. But it was just that sort of listening to that little voice in the back of your head that says, why not?
So you did it literally within a day of deciding?
I did. I thought about it on New Year's Eve. I thought it was a ridiculous idea, and then on New Year's Day I was like, still seems like it could be fun. Got the last train. I just sort of put some stuff in a bag, told my parents at like 4:00 in the afternoon. I was like, I'm getting the train, going down to Penzance. Got to Penzance at like midnight, tried to put up the tent in the car park. That didn't work very well, so I slept in a bus stop. Got going the next morning.
Had you done anything like that before? I mean, what was your experience levels before setting off?
Very low, very, very low. Never done anything like that before. Never really done anything that spontaneous. It was very much a step into the unknown, but I think it's one of those defining moments when you do something like that and you realize it is possible. As long as you're willing to put up with a bit of unpleasantness, like sleeping in a bus stop, which isn't that bad in the big scheme of things, there's a lot more that you can do. Did you have any experiences like that?
I'd done a short cycling trip towards the end of school, with some friends, and we cycled around the UK. But I mean, I say around the UK, we did very small parts of the UK on bicycles, and that was really the first time I owned a bike in my adolescent life. Was I bought it for that, and we just poodled around for a bit, and that was quite helpful because there was three of us, and so it wasn't quite as scary as being on my own. And also, I it's like your bus stop experience that it seems awful until you do it, and then you realize all of these things are actually very mild in the scheme of terrifying, horrible experiences, and in fact, they might not even really be terrifying or horrible at all. They might be something that you look back on with quite a deal of pride or sort of humor about.
Definitely.
So those first bike trips, little trip that I did, taught me some of that and gave me a bit more of the confidence to go off and plan a much bigger trip when I was leaving university. And I still had plenty of fear and uncertainty, but less so about I wasn't convinced that I was going to immediately die or get robbed. Which might have been a fear otherwise.
And so what was the trip that you planned when you graduated from uni?
I initially wondered if I could cycle all the way around the world, and then that seemed a bit big and I didn't really know where to start. So I went to New York City because I was going to do an internship at a documentary production house there, learn a little bit about filmmaking. And then I figured I would just take a bike or get a bike there and then just ride firstly across the US from west to east, and then keep going and just figure it out bit by bit. And I'd saved up for about a year after I left university with a journey like this in mind. And so the end point would be maybe arbitrary geographically, but it would be very, very definite based around when my money ran out.
Wow. So you literally went out and said, I'm going to cycle for as long as I can cycle. And when my dollar runs out, it's quits.
Yeah, pretty much. And I didn't have a huge amount. I had a few £1,000s, probably something like just under 5, something like that. I had more about when I went to New York City, and the idea was that I would save some more in New York City, and that was a terrible idea because I spent almost everything I'd earned in a year in a couple of months living there. But I set a few £100 aside, knowing that I could book a flight or a train or something back home from wherever I happened to be at the end of it, and the rest of it would just be frugally portioned out day by day. And the working premise was that most things should be free. My transport was my bicycle, that would be free. Water should always be free. Accommodation was my tent, so that was free. And all I needed to pay for was food, which I could buy in bulk and cook myself. And so I figured I could quite happily live on $2 or $3 a day, which turned out to be true. Even in the US, it wasn't too hard to do that.
Wow. Just $2 or $3 a day, and you managed to keep that going. That's impressive.
I bought bags of rice and lentils for dinners. I went to these kind of like secondhand, out of date stores that sold all the food a few months after the sell by date had expired. I bought kind of peanut butter and granola, and once a week I'd buy a bag of apples to make sure I didn't get scurvy, and that kind of kept me going. And there was so much else going on. There was so much else that was taking up my senses and filling me with things to think about and things to feel, that I didn't have any desire for certain types of food or taste that I was missing out on.
What kind of things were you experiencing?
Initially, it was very overwhelming. It was as big, if not bigger, a shock to my system. The two biggest shocks that I have had were going to university and suddenly being thrown into that very different type of lifestyle, and starting this bike trip and realizing that absolutely everything I did was going to succeed or fail based on decisions that I made and actions that I took or didn't take.
So it was really a realization of your own responsibility.
Completely.
It's all down to you.
Yeah. And eventually that becomes a positive force to know that. and it can be manifested that way. But to begin with, it's very scary. And I was riding this bicycle out of New York City, and I was getting lost even just trying to get out of the city, and it was overloaded, and I had too many things, and people were trying to stop me and talk to me because I had a loaded touring bike and I was dragging a trailer, and everyone's being very friendly, but I was preoccupied with trying to get out of the city and not fall over, and I'm wondering if I had all the right stuff, and very concerned that something might go wrong with my bicycle because I didn't know how to fix much of it other than a puncture. And then I had to think about finding places to sleep. There was dogs around, there might be wild animals, there was cars on the road that came very close, there was weather that I couldn't really predict, I had to navigate, there was hills and winds that I hadn't really accounted for, and I didn't have anywhere to be. I just had to not die, and even that sometimes seemed like a bit of a stretch.
What you're saying there kind of sums up, that there are always these like multitude of reasons of why we shouldn't do something. The dogs, the cars, the weather, the uncertainty. What got you through that? What helped you deal with those daunting challenges for someone who's never done cycle touring before?
Well, I was happy to be naive to start with, because if I'd known more about it, I knew just enough to know that it was possible and not enough to know that it might be quite hard to begin with.
Okay.
Which is a really nice sweet spot to be in. And so I started, and then really what kept me going in those first 2 weeks was the fact that I was so far from home. I actually had no idea how I would get home if I wanted to. I knew I probably could, but the logistics of it would have been a real headache, and I didn't feel capable of figuring that out. And actually, the easier option was to just keep pedaling, rather than think about how am I going to get to an airport, book a ticket, pack up my bike, or do I just give it away? Where do I stay? All that sort of stuff. Much easier just to wake up, roll out of my tent, get on my bike, and just turn my legs in a circle and try not to fall over. And being so far away from home was, I genuinely think if I'd started this from home, I was inept enough that after about a week, I would have probably just returned home, because I would probably still been close enough to get my mum to come and pick me up. And being in the middle of a new continent, albeit one that culturally has a lot of familiarity to me, and I could speak the same language as people and so on, it still felt like a very different world. And I was I sort of made that decision to start far away from home, knowing that I would be forced into continuing. And I was glad for that.
I find that can be a really powerful motivator to sort of embark on something without that many options of backing out, because that can really, not because you don't want to, if things goes terribly wrong, you want to have some sort of escape plan, but often there's a period of some time when you're really having to get through some things that feel quite unpleasant and difficult. But if you do, then if you can get beyond that, then it tends to be worth it. But sort of putting yourself into something of a corner can be quite a good way of succeeding when otherwise you might have sort of burrowed out of it.
Yeah. And the risk versus reward question was an interesting one for me, because the rewards were so great that it became quickly apparent to me that this was something that was worth persevering with. And by the rewards being great, I mean that my world is so small, and each pedal stroke, each mile made the world bigger to me and taught me so much more about both the planet and myself. I mean, it sounds quite cliched and cheesy to put it like that, but it's true. I was in such new territory every single moment of every day of that trip that each new landscape, each new interaction I had was an epiphany of some sort. And so the risks of the things I was scared of trouble with my bike or getting injured or meeting a bear in the woods, all of those things suddenly seemed to pale into insignificance compared to this. I mean, I could actively feel myself changing under the weight of this journey, and I felt, I could almost feel a sort of the first shoots of wisdom starting to come up, having gone 21 years without finding any.
So you got to spill the beans here. Like, what did you feel like you learned? How did it change you?
Well, I firstly I started to get a sense of the scale of our planet. I don't think until, I mean, I hadn't traveled very much before this, but even if I had, I would imagine I'd have mostly done it in planes and in motorized vehicles. And until you really feel a landscape under your own body and you're moving across it using your own power, that's when you start to get a sense of scale. And that's when you start to realize, I mean, I'd been pedaling for 2 weeks and I was still in New York State. I was still almost within
oh my goodness,
sight line of the city that I'd left. And to get that showed me where I was, that patch of land, how big that was, how big the country and continent I was on was, let alone the oceans that surrounded it and the rest of the planet. And so that was each day I could look to the horizon and just imagine how much there was between me and that line that I might be lucky to see some of, but I would also never get to know other things about. So a lot of it was that. There was also, I was meeting dozens of people every single day. And I was getting little snippets of their life and they were getting the same of mine. And most people were very friendly and kind to me. And many people took me in, let me stay in their homes, and I met their families, and I played with their dogs, and I went to see their kids play baseball, and all of these little interactions that I had. And I didn't have enough information in my brain to be able to form a philosophy about humans and humankind and our propensity for hospitality to one another, or whether I felt like we were inherently kind or not kind, or good to each other or not good to each other. I was either completely ill-informed or I was too informed by the news cycle and the daily headlines. And suddenly here I was seeing it for myself. And later in that journey, I then started to, the next level of that is realizing that the interactions I had were based on another set of predetermined factors, such as my own background, my own privileges, the color of my skin, my accent, my passport, all of these things. And it was only later that I then realized how my journey might have been different had I looked different or sounded different or so on. So there's many layers to these, but that first one was very, very pure, a real sense of wonder at what a vast and generous world I was entering into.
Yeah, and I think that's something we'll come back to later, I suppose, in a slightly different context when you touched on, I guess, the interactions that you had, and you said you're either sort of too well informed, or so not really that well informed at all, or kind of it was very similar to perhaps what you knew, and that seems to have been quite a formative experience, given your later direction in trying to really tackle the challenge of, or challenging people's perspectives, particularly with people who groups of people who are portrayed in a certain and often negative way by mainstream media.
Yeah. And to a certain degree, a lot of what I've been trying to do in recent years is exactly that: to replicate the experience I had, but to make it accessible to individuals and communities that would not often get a chance to do that. Because a lot of people who look like me get to go and do the sorts of journeys that I did, and they may or may not choose to do that. And it's there's a huge amount of value in it. It still requires a great deal of fortitude and I think it is as powerful as it ever was, but it shouldn't just be limited to by any of those other
Mm.
factors. And so I would like to, in any way I can, try and create more of an opening for these sorts of experiences that changed my life to impact upon others as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very aware that we are both white, male, British, got a redback passport. And recently I chatted with Ryan Pyle, who's another adventurer. He is, white, male, Canadian. I would love to. I think this will be definitely a future podcast of talking to someone who is at least not male, and I guess some of the challenges that they've faced in. Yes, there are challenges that we've faced doing adventures, but I wonder to the extent to which we've had it very easy and it is just the tip of the iceberg of the
Yeah,
potential
I mean,
challenges.
if it's looked at in relative terms, and I think that's something that I think is really important to acknowledge as well, is that the experience that you or I might have isn't diminished by the factors that are outside of our control, and we still create the circumstances for ourselves. We still do things that may push us to our physical, mental limits. We might take things on, as you have done, things that are at the very, I imagine, at the very outer edge of what you think is possible. And you want to really take on something which pushes you in a lot of different ways and challenges you in many different ways. And so I don't think those elements are diminished, and it's very important that we remember how powerful those are to us. But equally, yes, there are a large number of people, a large number of communities who would find it much more difficult to enact their dreams or the types of challenges they might want to self-impose upon themselves. They might find it much harder to have a way to do that. And so we should be, mostly we should just be very grateful for the privileges we have, and in the ways that we do try and use those for a good purpose as well.
I think that is absolutely right. I think we are incredibly lucky. I spent some time in Greece, just a few days, and spoke with some Syrian refugees, and what we can take for granted. There are so many things that we can take for granted, but we can take for granted that we could start an expedition in New York or in Spain, and for them it is, for those people I spoke to, it would be basically impossible for them to leave Greece, and it would be very challenging in other ways for them just to leave the city that they were in. And of course, that is just a tiny part of it. So you did this cycle ride. You got to Hong Kong. I think it was 14,000 miles you did?
Yeah.
So that's a pretty long way. You made that money go quite a long way in a very literal sense.
I did. And it is a long way. And I could have kept going. I would have been happy to keep going, but the money had run out. And also I wasn't too sad about going home either. So I ended up going home.
How long had you been on the road?
It was a couple of years by that point, because I stopped off. I stopped off in New Zealand for a while, and a couple other places as well for a couple of months.
Okay.
Here and there.
Very briefly, where did you go? You started in New York, and what was?
So I went across the US, and then I rode down the West Coast. I got as far as Mexico, and then I sort of changed my mind and came back up. I'd met a pilot who reckoned he could get me a free or very inexpensive flight to New Zealand, which he did manage to do.
Wow.
So I suddenly ended up in New Zealand, which was a very totally new territory. I hadn't planned to go there. So from that point onwards, all my other plans fell apart. But New Zealand, Australia, and then up through Southeast Asia into China, and eventually curved back around and came down to Hong Kong, where I knew a couple of people and figured that was a good place to take stock. And then from there I flew to Europe and rode back across Europe to have a sort of final foray before I came back to what I assumed was going to be more of a normal lifestyle. I had no idea what waited me at that point. And actually, one of the biggest challenges of all of this was coming back from this wonderful, life-changing, life-enhancing experience, feeling full of wonder at the world and, feeling full of confidence in myself, and coming back to have no idea how I would make a living, or where I would even begin to do that. And sleeping on my cousin's sofa for a few months, trying to find work that was vaguely in the sphere that I might enjoy, and coming up short.
That does sound, I mean, on one hand, a very privileged challenge to have, but like a really big challenge in that you've found something that you've enjoyed a huge amount. It sounds like you're quite much more comfortable perhaps than you'd ever been in your own skin. And then you come back to the UK with a different value system that basically says what you've done is perhaps great, but we're not really interested in you in that way. Unless you can do a spreadsheet or whatever it might be, what you have to offer, Leon, isn't necessarily what we're interested in.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny looking back at that time. I don't remember too much. I mean, one of the great things about the human brain is it blocks out a lot of pain and suffering. Okay. So you remember broadly the type of experience you had, but you don't remember the specifics of the struggle or the suffering, which I think is probably something we can be grateful for. But I think at the time I held on to things pretty lightly, and I knew for sure after that trip that I wasn't going to settle for doing something that I didn't really enjoy, or that I didn't think was worthwhile, or that I wouldn't be very good at. And I kind of made my peace with the fact that I would rather go and do something somewhere else, go back to New Zealand and work on a farm there for a few years, than take the sort of job that a lot of my peers had taken in London, and were doing very well and were building a nice life for themselves. And whilst I was admiring of their decisions because it seemed to suit them, I just knew that I couldn't do it, not in good conscience.
Was that difficult? Did your friends understand?
No, not really. But I think I've probably always been a bit unusual, to be honest. And I don't, it's very hard to self-prescribe with any of this stuff. But a lot of the things that seem to make a lot of sense to me don't necessarily make a lot of sense to friends and people I grew up with. And I've gotten kind of used to that. And perhaps I've now got a community of friends and colleagues around me who think along more similar lines. But my value system was definitely quite different. And people couldn't understand why I would want to do that, and wouldn't want to join a more standard career path. But never even, once I'd been on that bike trip, I couldn't even entertain the idea. It just, it wasn't going to work for me, and I wouldn't have felt fulfilled doing it. So it wasn't an option.
Okay. So what did come next?
Well, when I'd been in Hong Kong, I'd met with a cyclist called Rob Lilwall, who had ridden from Siberia back to London over the course of 3 years and wrote a really wonderful book about it. Yeah, it's fantastic. Really wonderful book.
I really enjoyed it.
I'd met Rob at his book launch, actually, initially, before I set off on my trip. And we didn't know each other very well at all, but he did say to me that if I made it to Hong Kong on my bike, I could come and stay. So I did a few years later. And Rob was still keen to have me to stay, and so I went, and we got to know each other, and we decided that it might be really interesting to try and explore more of China. And Rob was looking for someone who knew how to use a camera. I was looking for something to do if I was giving up the bike trip quite soon. And so we spent, even after I got back to London, we spent 6 months trying to make that work as an idea, and we eventually did. Through Rob's contacts, we got a commission to make a TV series about it, which was remarkable given that neither of us had much experience in that sort of thing. It was very much out of our league of expertise, but someone took a chance on us. And so I just tried to keep things ticking over. and give myself enough time to, I didn't rent an apartment or do anything like that. I just slept on friends' sofas, and did a little bit of kind of copywriting work, which brought in enough money to pay for some food. And then I spent the rest of my time planning this trip, and eventually flew to Hong Kong and started walking, and then flew to Mongolia and started walking back across China with Rob.
Wow, that's quite an adventure. But before we came on air, we talked a bit about actually what perhaps you considered to be a challenge changed quite a lot from, I guess, the start of your bike ride. There were a lot of things that you felt quite unsure or perhaps a little bit, daunted by. But you said to me something that was quite interesting, that, now you feel that was almost, that had ceased to be a challenge, or that kind of adventure at some point, it kind of ceased to be so much of a challenge. Is that right?
Yeah. I think all of us have an ongoing relationship with the idea of challenge and what it means to us. And you will have had that. I mean, your understanding of it, I'm sure, will have morphed and changed remarkably through your journey.
Definitely.
And in a very different way, mine did too. It was about the biggest challenge I could imagine, going off on a bicycle and fending for myself and seeing if I could get back home again. And I did that, but and then it was a huge challenge to try and turn what I love doing into a career, and get a TV show contract with Rob, and then a challenge to try and walk across 3,000 miles of China, and to combine that with shooting a TV show, neither of which were things I'd done before. Phenomenal challenge.
Yeah. I tried to do some filming sense. And like on the start of the Bristol to Beijing cycle ride, and like, my goodness, it's really difficult.
It is really difficult, and it takes a lot of practice, and I'm sure you will have found as well that the more you do it, the more you get into a rhythm with it. But it does take quite a lot of, it takes a huge amount of energy, and it impacts on the trip. And and then after that China trip, I went to the Empty Quarter Desert with a guy called Alistair Humphreys, and we walked across that, and we made a film about it. And so each of those was a type of challenge, but it was mostly internal. It was mostly, first of all, figuring out who I was, and then challenging myself to get better and to do more, and to fulfill certain ambitions that I had. And what I would say is that in recent years, whilst I would still love to go and walk across deserts and do things like that, I don't have as much of a desire to do it, because it wouldn't fulfill me as much personally. And I have spent a lot of time thinking about the sort of things we talked about at the start of this, of the sort of privileges and access that I've had to these types of experiences, and how can I be some sort of vessel to make that more likely for someone else. And so I've ended up looking at stories that involve communities who are marginalized a lot, in the Middle East and elsewhere, communities who are deeply misunderstood, and that's led me into a whole other field, and we can talk about that if you like. But I would say that of course, there's still personal challenges for me in everyday life, but the biggest one is how do I take what I've been given, and then what I've created myself on top of that, to do something really useful in the world? How do I leave behind something? And that's an enormous challenge. How do we create something worthwhile with our time on Earth?
It's I think that's like hitting the nail on the head, isn't it? I think for so many people, when you move past things like money and possessions and status, of those can be motivators, but then beyond that, that's something that certainly I've come back to quite a few times, and I'm sure a lot of people have come back to, is how can you leave your mark? And I think everyone tries to leave a positive mark, in their own way, something that will leave the world a slightly better place if we're lucky.
Yeah.
So can you give us an example about these communities, the narratives that you're trying to shed more light on or more nuance. This is something I'm very interested in, the kind of cancer sphere of like, what's possible with a cancer diagnosis. It's like, come on, guys, like there is more to life in some senses. That's really a discussion for another time. But what are some of the narratives you've been looking at?
Well, I think what you just said is really important, because it has to be something that you, not necessarily you have some sort of authority to talk about, but something that you have a direct way to communicate that. One of the questions I ask myself quite a lot is, why should it be me that's telling this story? Why am I the one to be here? And what can I bring to it that nobody else could? I mean, it started quite soft transition for me. I did a couple of expeditions. One was in Iran, where I followed the longest river in the country from source to sea with Tom Allen, and
really enjoyed that film. Wolves
good,
on the first night, and then you were kayaking down the Karun in kayaks that you kind of blew up, and you had them in backpacks, right? And
they were wonderful. Yeah, and
I was so jealous.
It was a fantastic trip, and it was really, it was real adventure, a lot of that one. And there's two twin goals for that. One was to see if we could get from one end of the river to the other. And the second was to create a film that showed a different version of Iran from the one that so many people understood. One that was focused on the natural beauty of the landscape and the hospitality and kindness of regular Iranian people. And I used to talk quite a lot about finding humanity in these places, but I've realized that maybe that's not the best word to use, because it's almost condescending. Of course, people are human. They shouldn't have to prove that, but it's
definitely
to do a journey like that was wonderful, because it was just, all we had to do was just meet people and talk to them, and then we made this film about how wonderful Iran is. So it started off with things like that, and the Middle East became a big focus for me, and now more recently I've been working on projects around hiking trails, and hiking trails are about much more than walking. We're so used to them in the UK because they're everywhere in most of Western Europe. We're very fortunate to have them.
Tell us more about hiking trails, because I thought hiking trails were just about walking.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess I did too, or maybe I didn't even think enough to form that thought. But they're in many ways a platform for a lot of other wonderful things to happen. The first real experience I had with hiking trails was when I walked from Jerusalem to Mount Sinai in this sort of, and eventually back to Jerusalem in this kind of loop of the Holy Land region. And on that trip, I used a series of relatively new and locally owned hiking trails. One called the Masai Ibrahim, which I know that runs the length of Palestine, the Jordan Trail, and the Sinai Trail across the Sinai Peninsula. And those trails were all developed over a number of years as a way to create opportunities for people within those countries to access the landscape and to use it and see it in a new way, to kind of bond people and their country together, to create an industry and an economy for tourists to come and experience these things as well, and to build kind of a sense of pride and ownership over the landscape. And so they've been very successful in doing that, and have totally reinvented the way that, for example, Palestinians see their own land, as well as how outsiders and internationals might see Palestinian land.
It's really interesting that that point about it not just being trails being for the international tourists, because before this podcast, you told me about how you're helping set up a trail in northern Iraq, and I was like, great, this looks like the perfect adventure for me. Next thing, go. But that's actually, maybe it's part of the point, but it's a lot more than just sort of giving another holiday destination or adventure destination for Western tourists.
Yeah, but I mean, absolutely, it is also part of the point. I mean, it's a wonderful place, and you would love it. I love it. Many people would love it. It's alpine scenery in northern Iraq. It's beautiful, uh, big peaks and lush valleys and so on. But it's also about, more importantly, helping to build, helping to create a platform upon which local people can enjoy the mountains. And in northern Iraq, particularly, as with much of the Middle East in general, but more so in this region, the mountains have been very important in the Kurdish area where I've been working. And they've always been a place where people have sheltered from conflict and from aggressors. And so mountains have been very important to people, but their protection and their safety. And historically, people fled into the mountains to get away from danger. And the project that we've been working on now is building upon an existing desire from young Kurds and young Iraqis in general as well to come and to see those mountains in a new light and to see them as somewhere that people can enjoy and learn from, rather than just somewhere that is a safe haven. And so to kind of find these old trails that they might be shepherd's paths or old pilgrimage ways or trading routes or any of these sorts of things. So much history and culture embedded into that little patch of soil. It gives people who might predominantly live in the cities a way to get out, enjoy their landscape, feel a sense of pride and connection to the land around them. And then if they're so inclined, it's either something that just helps people get out, be fit and healthy and so on. Or it can be, people can get involved in pioneering a new type of tourism and adventure tourism industry and can become guides and, start up local initiatives along the trail and help it become something much bigger as it has done in other places.
That's something that I've done with my brother back in 2015. We cycled in Lebanon, something called Poly Liban, which is very similar, but on bikes. And it's really about getting, opening up Lebanon to Lebanese people so they can see some of the incredible beauty, see some of the, the villages that otherwise no one would ever see, and have an opportunity for interactions that wouldn't otherwise be possible.
And what was your overwhelming takeaway from that journey?
That's a great question. I was amazed at how passionate the people were. The people who put on and ran Poly Liban cared no less about what they were doing than a triathlon outfit in the UK, or a top pro running team, or pro runners, or training squad. They were absolutely passionate about exercise, about the beauty of Lebanon, about doing something like cross faith as well. And of course, in Lebanon, that's particularly pertinent, given it's a country made up of Christians, Sunni Muslims, Shia Muslims, Druze, and more. So it was a safe space and a forum, I suppose, as well.
Yeah, and trails in the act of hiking or cycling, they're all very non-threatening activities, right? And they involve, they are sport, but you're never in opposition with each other. It's kind of people moving in the same direction and being alongside each other, and it's all very conducive to creating a way for these sort of dialogues to happen.
And I also want to I'm sure some people might be thinking, Iraq, isn't that a dangerous place? Can you tell us a bit more about the Kurdish region before we move on?
Yeah, I mean, Kurdish region is autonomous from the rest of Iraq, so it's still Iraqi, but it has its own government. It has its own borders. It has its own regulations for entry. So coronavirus time accepted, normally you can just fly to one of the airports and get a visa on arrival, go through. It's very safe. I mean, it's most of the region is, I would argue, safer than most European and American cities, but it's safe even by regional standards, and it's very, very beautiful. It's I spent a lot of time over the last 4 years there. There is a tourism industry there. People come to see some of the older sites. There's a lot of old monasteries and other religious minority sites, and Erbil, the capital of the Kurdish region in Iraq, has got a 7,000-year-old citadel in the middle of it, and so it's a really wonderful place. And I mean, there's certainly no the threats that people might associate with mentions of Iraq, like conflict or kidnapping. None of those are things that people need to worry about in Kurdistan. And the only way for anyone really to take my word for it is to come visit.
Right. When do I get to come out and visit you?
As soon as coronavirus goes away.
Amazing. Looking forward to it. You mentioned before that at this really interesting point of, am I the best person to do this role? Am I the best person to try and challenge perceptions, shed new light, build trails? Have you been able to answer that question for yourself?
Yeah, in some circumstances. I think, in regards to the trail work that I'm doing, I find a method to work there where I can use some of the skills and knowledge I have from a few years of work in this field, alongside contacts to bring in funding and be able to create the infrastructure for the development, but still allow local stakeholders, local pioneers, to be the ones who direct and shape the vision of the project. So it's still something that is very locally owned, and I just use the attributes that I can bring to help that come to life. Other things are more difficult. I mean, I do some work as a journalist, and I love writing stories about certain communities, and I've done a lot with communities like the Samaritans community, who live in the West Bank, who are possibly the smallest and oldest ethno-religious group in the world. And
these are the Samaritans of the Good Samaritan, right?
Yeah, exactly. Of the Bible times, the Jews from Judea and the Samaritans from Samaria, as those regions were 2,000 plus years ago. And so the Samaritans, there was 1.5 million of them in the Roman era. There's now just over 800, and they have this very odd but wonderful existence in the midst of the Israel-Palestine question and everything else regionally. And I've written a lot and done a lot of different types of projects with the Samaritan community, but with stuff like that, I sometimes wonder, is there someone better placed who can tell this story from a more local perspective, or who's got a different insight? And in journalism and crossing into some aspects of adventure and adventure writing in particular these days, I think that's the question we've got to ask, is what value do we have in sending out international correspondence to a place if there's someone in that place who can already tell that story? Is this the end of the era for foreign correspondence? And probably not, because there are people with certain types of knowledge who will who still have a purpose to go places, and still a reality that most audiences want to hear from someone who they feel they have a connection with previously. But I think it is a time to lift up local voices, to lift up voices from minority communities, and help people tell their own story rather than have outsiders like me always be the one to come in and tell it.
Has that been difficult to make a career out of it? Is there an appetite for, sure, I enjoy listening to these things, but do you find there isn't an appetite for these stories that do talk about minorities, which don't reinforce our pre-existing notions of how things are?
Not really, to be honest. It's not, it's much, I mean, so one example is that I went to southern Iraq at the end of 2018 to join a pilgrimage, which is called Arba'in, which is the largest annual pilgrimage in the world. So between 20 and 25 million Shia Muslims come to walk between two holy cities in southern Iraq, and they walk. It's not a huge distance; it's about 50 miles, but people of all ages walk it. Women walk alongside men, and everyone comes, and it's a time to a very spiritual time, and of course, it's very peaceful, and it's really wonderful. No money changes hands. All these volunteers come out and create essentially a pop-up city that runs the length of the 50-mile route, and they provide food and accommodation for everyone along the way. And it's the most incredible display of how humans look out for one another. And very little's been written about it. And I went there and joined the journey and had everything I needed for what I thought would be a really interesting account of it. And I pitched it to a number of places, and a lot of people just said, no, it's not of interest, or, it's not really what our readers want. And eventually when I did get it commissioned, and I'm very grateful to the publications that did commission it, a couple of them said, to be honest, in order for us to run this, we need you to feature in it. We need you to tell it as a sort of first person narrative account of your experience of being there.
Oh, my goodness.
So,
so going against what you set out to do in a sense.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's not, it's not necessarily, of course, it's still a relatively interesting story of me as what it's like to be someone from here writing about being part of this religious pilgrimage when I'm not a member of the faith or from the country. But I think it says a lot that was the angle it had to, it needed to have a link to in order for them to justify that their readers would go for it.
How do you think, what actions can you take, or we as a slightly wider community take, to change that?
Well, it's step by step, and I think I was still pleased that particular story was printed in a major publication, and that people got to read about it. And even if they read about it through my lens, then I still got to write about all the wonderful things about it. So I think the stories that we can tell, even from our perspectives, are valuable. But I also think that every opportunity that we have, we should use to lift up others who may not have that. And so when I can, I help mentor a couple of good friends and very talented storytellers in Iraqi Kurdistan, who at some point will be able to find a platform for their own stories. And in the meantime, I just share with them any knowledge that I've been fortunate enough to pick up. And I also think that as future opportunities arise for me, I'll think very carefully about whether or not it feels appropriate for me to tell those stories, or whether I should at very least do it in collaboration with someone locally who's better placed to do that.
So when you started and you went for your long distance ride, that took you out your comfort zone, and there are a lot of challenges in that. And then after a few more adventures, you kind of realized you'd been selecting the challenges. You'd been sort of still very lucky to be able to put yourself in these challenging situations rather than just having challenge come along. And now you're working in areas where people do have these challenges. Whether it's internal conflict, losing people very close to them. How well do you feel that you're able to relate to people who have lost their families or their homes, or seen some pretty horrible stuff?
I mean, experience there's only so much we can ever really walk in someone else's shoes, and I think uh, I can never truly I can never truly feel what that person feels, but I can empathize and I can do my best to imagine. And I can just, I mean, the best thing I find is to just try and let my guard down and respond as humanly as I feel fit. And there's a sort of sense sometimes when you hear stories that are very difficult that you try and project a response in a certain way because you want the person you're speaking to feel that it's managed and that you're not taking on their woes and making them your own and so on. But if I hear pretty harrowing things, as I do sometimes, then those things are really awful, and sometimes just to acknowledge that is the best possible thing. And also, there's nothing I can really do about that other than just listen. But what I can perhaps do is I can listen, which does help. And if I'm writing a story, often people like their story to be told. Often I find that nobody's really taken an interest before, and it's of great value to have someone willing to tell that story and put it in context. And I always try and think, what can I do here that other people won't do? Why am I here, basically? And it's what can I to create something positive out of it. And with a trail initiative or a storytelling project, each of those pieces becomes one more building block in trying to create something good out of the situation.
I think what you said there about your words or presence nearly all the time can't solve the problems, can't change the problems happening, or can't change the past. But being there with someone through that emotion can, going down onto that level of where that person is, can be a very helpful and positive thing.
Tell me about it from your perspective. So from people that you have, let's say, friends, family around you, how did people react to your journey and your diagnosis, and what did you find was the more helpful types of reactions for you?
Yeah, so certainly some helpful, I guess from different people, the different things were helpful. I was amazingly grateful, or I'm very grateful to my friends from university for being a group of people who could accept the information, and then we could just carry on as we'd always carried on. And I didn't have to feel like I was sort of, special or different. We can, have a good time, play games, have a few beers, and that was as normal. And that having that sense of normalcy was very, very helpful. I think what was often difficult is, I think anytime anyone says, I know what you're going through, I know how it feels, like even if they'd had been through something similar, you're like, bullshit. Like, you don't know what I'm going through right now. So I think that's always something to stay away from. I think you can echo back, if I'd said, God, like this just feels so tough right now, and I'm really scared. I think saying, crikey, I can, it sounds like you're going through something which is just incredibly tough and scary. It sounds like you're just kind of saying exactly what they just said. But it's amazing actually how powerful that is as a listening technique of actually showing that you've listened to what someone else has said. And I think for so many people, right, like if we're going through a challenge or a problem, feeling that someone else really has listened to us about what that challenge is, also feels like they understand you as well. And hopefully they do to a greater extent. So I think that can be really helpful.
Mm. It's do you think it's something that people have, do you think some people are naturally better at listening in these sorts of circumstances, or do you think it's something that people learn how to do?
I think there's a bit of both in that. I think some people tend to just give more time and be more patient in listening, and I think that might be to a large extent, a reflection of priorities that we've either grown up with, or we've seen our parents do, or other people that we admire, or we've made a conscious decision about that. But I think there's a large part which is also learned, like, before I received my diagnosis, before I lost my brother, like, I think I was pretty insensitive, not in a callous way, but like, I just didn't get it. Like, what was loss? What was the challenge of cancer? Like, I had my exams to study for. I had my life to go out and live. I didn't have time to like hold people's hands as they went through challenges. Like, I don't sound very good here, but I think that's, to a large extent, I think that's true. And I think it's true for a lot of people, unless you've gone through a challenge, or you've had a friend or a close, someone who's close to you go through that challenge. Or I think books can be, I think that's the beauty perhaps of books and great art, is that it can help you get inside the mind of someone else, and that will really great art, it'll stay with you for a bit. By art, film, books, photography.
Would that be your advice to people then who maybe have feel like they have not necessarily gone through anything of great difficulty themselves, and might want to check themselves as to how they empathize more with others? Would your advice be to read more, to watch more, to engage more?
Yeah, I think certainly engagement. I think, it's not a case of simply, watching and reading random things, I suppose. It's, I'll probably have a think, and if I get some good ideas, I'll put it in the links below, the things that I found really impactful. But actually, I think this is one of the aims of the podcast, is to give this space where, if you don't know what it's like to be sexually abused or have that experience, that this is a place where you can hear about what that has been like for someone else. And that might, be something that you take away and think about for a long time.
Yeah. I think this is something it took me a lot of years to realize. But there is a responsibility in all of us to educate ourselves about what others might be going through, and to educate ourselves on how to best position ourselves to be there for those around us, and whether that's in very specific scenarios, or whether that's just in a broader sense to be a crutch to help people when they're in need, individually or as communities. I more and more strongly feel that the older I get and the more I travel, that certainly someone like me has no excuse to live an insular life and just look out for myself and have no experience of the outside world and people who don't have what I have. And which is a change from what I might have thought a few years ago, because I would have previously probably subscribed, as long as I wasn't doing any harm, it was fine. But I think we're built for more than that, and we're capable of more than that.
That's a fascinating word, responsibility. I hadn't ever thought about it like that, that we actually, it's not necessarily a choice, but it's a responsibility to be conscious about others and look out for others. I definitely didn't think of it. I'm not sure I still think of it. I mean, I'm not sure at this point I think of it like in those terms, but I definitely didn't in the past. But that's going to stay with me. The responsibility to look out for others.
I think it is. And, how we all interpret that is up to ourselves. And there's no exam on this, right? Like, it's not like we ever get tested to see whether or not we did it right or how much we did. It's just within our own conscience that we live with that. But the more I, especially at times like this, when we're in the midst of a pandemic and a lot of things are brought into sharper focus, it's a time for, I mean, it feels to me like the whole world is kind of collectively inhaling at this point. And I can see even at this time, I have a moment to pause and reflect, and I'm quite enjoying this time. Honestly, it's a break for me. But that experience in itself is very much at odds with much of the world, and with a lot of close friends of mine. People are really struggling. They're not sure where money's going to come from. They're not sure how their businesses are going to survive after this. And people are being hit in different sectors now than have been hit by other things that we've gone through in a national or international sense. And so even just this moment in time brings this to the fore for me, and makes me once again reassess. It's probably quite a good thing to do reasonably regularly, is reassess where we're each at, and what we're trying to do, and what we are doing, and what we could do more and better.
Definitely. I think we don't want to get to the end of our lives and realize that we've been working towards things that we then realize we don't care that much about, whatever that is. And so I have also been reflecting in this time, which is bizarre because I thought I'd kind of like had the kick up the arse that I would ever, like the biggest kick up the arse I'd ever need to like kind of get my priorities straight. But, no, I'm thinking about it again. I'm like, okay, what do I really want to do? What do I really value? What's important? And I don't think it ever stops.
But also what I think you've done, and which is the thing I find particularly wonderful and inspiring about what you've been doing from when we first met, is that you use that as a springboard to launch onto everything else, and each of us needs something to start us on that. And I'm sure if you could choose, you wouldn't have chosen the way that it happened for you, but you took something that could have crushed many people and used it as something really positive, and not just for yourself but for others. And I think that's it's very hard to, I try and never be prescriptive about this. I don't feel like I'm in any position to be telling anyone else how to live their lives or what they should do. But if I speak just for me and you, I can say that I think what you've done is wonderful. You've taken a very personal experience and a very challenging one, and you've turned it into something that you're using to better yourself and to reach out to others as well. In my constant challenge and ongoing challenge is, how do I do things that I could be proud of, that I think will make something better somewhere and will impact on someone's life positively. And if I can do that even just once, even just a handful of times, I'll be pretty happy with that.
Yeah, I think it's a double positive. One, there's a positive impact on the wider world, and two, there's an internal positive impact, because I don't think there's anything more rewarding from my own experience than seeing good come about from actions or projects that one has put like a huge amount of time and effort into. Can we finish by, can you tell us about one project or story or something that you worked really hard on, and the impact that that's had?
I think, there's a few things in the last couple of years that I've been really proud to be part of, and I I feel like the work. I mean, I'll just go back to it because it's really the thing that's the forefront of my mind is this work in the Kurdish region of northern Iraq, and um, we're just. I started this thing there thinking it would maybe take a year, 2 years to help catalog trails and turn it into something that people could enjoy. It's becoming rapidly clear that it will take a decade probably to really do this properly. But through that, I've made the most wonderful friends. I've found a place that is so far from my own home, but yet where I feel so at home. And I can, because I've been there from the very beginning of it, I can see already how it's helping impact on people's lives to have the facility there and the promise of more facility of trails and jobs and everything that comes alongside it. So that's something I'm proud to have been involved with at this point. But I hope we could have this conversation again and I hope we do in another 6 or 7 years, and that it's something I can really point to and say this is something, and I'm just a small part of it, but it's doing real good.
I'm really looking forward to that conversation, and I want to meet you and raise you and say, let's actually have it out in Kurdistan.
Absolutely. Well, we'll arrange a time in a nice section of trail, and you'll be very welcome to come out. Perhaps you can swing by on your bike.
I can't wait. Leon, it's been really fantastic chatting today. Some very thought-provoking discussions in there as well. Thanks so much for your time.
It's a pleasure. Yeah, thank you.
Cheers.